All right, and on that note, I figure the best way to show y'all how the game really looks is to really show you the sequence. And so what I've done is I've created a log file of a sequence that the developers have made in their Eastfront manual. It's called Operation Edelweiss. It can be found at the end of the Eastfront manual. And basically what I want to show is the entire sequence because they do a great job of really showing not only how the game looks, but how does a battle sequence look like, what are the typical types of operations that one can expect, and kind of the transition between one turn to another. And so with that, let's go ahead and actually do the sequence. So what I'm going to show is basically a single fortnight. A fortnight is part of a game month, and within a fortnight, you have the Axis player turn, followed by the Soviet player turn, or really, depending on what the weather looks like, you have a particular side that gets to go first. So since the weather right now is dry, the Axis player gets to go first, and we're going to start with the Axis player turn, followed by the Soviet player turn. And all these different steps, by the way, can be found if you open up the player aid tab in the Vassal engine. You can see this column here. This column pretty much breaks down all the different steps that go into a turn. They're basically broken up into phases. You're going to have a production phase, for example, but you only do that once per month. And then within every month, you're going to have 2 fortnights. And within each fortnight, you're going to have this command phase, movement phase, combat phase, any possible blitz phases that follow, followed by a supply phase. And those are kind of the main phases to be aware of. You may also have a political phase if we're playing, if in that turn, let's say you had finished conquering an enemy nation, you're going to do some politics. You may even start the entire sequence with a diplomacy phase, which happens at the start of the month, and you can use that to bring another nation into the war or have some sort of geopolitical change in your favor, depending on which faction you're playing as. And so that pretty much sums it all up. But let's dive ahead. I really want to show you all how it looks. And so the first thing that we're going to see is that the Axis player unhides their HQ. Every time that you see an HQ being unhidden, it's basically being activated. So this is the command phase. And in the command phase, you basically declare which HQs you want to command units. And when that happens, you expect this unit to expend its command points, but what it gains is the ability to have units that can be moved across other parts of the front. So this is a regular field HQ. Its range is going to be equivalent to its command value. Since its command value is 2, that means that all the units within 2 hexes from this HQ are going to be within range. So pretty much all these other dark square hidden units are within range of this German HQ, as well as those within the same hex as the HQ. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the movement phase. What it basically looks like is the German player deploying, or I think the right term they use is mobilizing all the different units within that range and actually getting them into the battle, into attack positions or defensive positions, depending on whether you're attacking or defending. Since we're playing 1942, summer 1942, presumably this is the German offensive towards Stalingrad, Case Blue, or something like it. And so the Germans are the ones with the strategic initiative, and they get to go first because of that initiative. So anyways, German player goes ahead and starts stacking a lot of units along the front. We end up having a lot of river assaults. If I haven't mentioned it before, those hex side limits that I was talking about, they apply to only battle hexes. You don't have to worry about that for friendly hexes. It only applies to battle hexes. Now you might be thinking that the unit moving from Mariupol to Rostov might be a river assault, and that would be correct. But since other units were moving via land to Rostov, you can think of all the German units as linking up at Rostov, so you actually don't have to worry about any river assaults for that particular hex. However, when we look at these other hexes the German army is attacking, you can see that the only routes available to attack these Soviet-controlled hexes is across rivers. And so you only have a maximum capacity of units that can attack. This Soviet hex, for example, has 2 enemy hex sides allows 2 German units to cross. Over here, in this area that would be known as Rostov East 2, since it's 2 hexes away from Rostov, it only has 1 enemy hex side, so only 1 German unit can cross. And likewise, for this final hex in Kotolnikovo, 2 German units are attacking, one from Kalash, the other one a little bit south of that, and you can see that its route actually hadn't moved south, and then it moved east into the Koltonikovo hex. And altogether, you again have 2 enemy hex side limits, which only allows up to 2 German units on this phase to move across. If later on we have another movement phase, we can send more troops across, but in this round of combat, this is all we're going to get. And so, in addition to the regular dice rules that apply to hits, we're also going to have to apply some assault or some repulse dice rolls as well, or at least the values of those dice rolls, and that will determine whether or not our units make it across. Finally, we also indicate with our HQ, presumably if we don't mobilize the HQ, we can support combat to all these areas, and we can even provide airstrike to one of them. And so German player has placed airstrike here in Rostov, since that's the main target and that's where the main German attack is taking place. So now we're going to go ahead and start the battle sequence. We've done the command, we've done the movement phase, now for the combat phase. And so we're going to start here at the Battle of Rostov, where the airstrike is located, and we're basically going to move from left to right. First thing we're going to do is start with the airstrike. The airstrike is kind of seen as a first strike, and the way you can determine the combat damage of airstrike is by looking at basically the firepower level of that air power, given the front and given the time of year. And so you can find all that information in one of the tables here. It's called the air firepower table, and really depending on, again, what part of the front we're talking about, which faction, and also what time of year, you can determine whether or not your firepower is going to be either single, double, or triple. And if you're wondering what that S, D, and TF stand for, it's single fire, double fire, and triple fire. And so the way the developers have done it is that single fire is going to grant you hits only on 6s, double fire is going to grant you hits on 5 or 6s, triple fire grants you hits on 4, 5, or 6s. And since we're dealing with 6-sided dice, we know that single fire is basically a 1 in 6 chance, a double fire is a 2 in 6 chance, and a triple fire is a 3 in 6 chance, or a 50% chance of scoring a hit. So there's some basic probability there, but this game is a dice-based game, so we will be dealing with this all the time. It applies to battles. It also applies to not only battles, but it applies to a few other mechanics in the game, but we're going to be dealing with dice roll all the time. But for the sake of battles, it's important to simply be aware of that single fire, double fire, and triple fire effects. There's also a few other effects that are applied to defensive characteristics, and basically the terrain can grant a defender additional defensive bonuses as well as firepower bonuses. And the 3 types are basically single defense, which is pretty much the normal form of defense. There's also double defense, which is abbreviated by DD, and that basically doubles the amount of damage that the defenders can withstand. And then finally, triple defense triples that. And so it becomes really relevant, as you'll see in, say, the Battle of Rostov here. So anyways, we're going to go ahead with the Battle of Rostov, and we're going to start with that airstrike. The airstrike rolls, and they score a 4 and a 5. Now, again, remember that airstrike was double fire, so if we look at the double fire values, we know that the airstrike scored a hit, since it scored a 5. Now, you might be thinking that this Soviet unit would have received a hit, and typically it would, but we have to double check the terrain effects of a major city like Rostov. And we can open up the player table, look through these tables until we find the terrain effects table, which is right here. And we go down to major cities, we look at the way it affects the different properties that can apply to different hexes. It's not going to affect stacking or hex sides or movement, but it will affect the firepower and the defensive characteristics of that area. The defender is going to get double fire, and as mentioned, and they're also going to get double defense. So that means that in order for the German player to neutralize this entire Soviet unit in Rostov, they're going to have to score not 3 hits, but 6 hits to defeat them. So we're going to have to keep that in mind as we continue on with the battle sequence. So basically, we scored half a hit with this airstrike, but no more. Next, the defenders get to roll. Defender dice always get to roll before the attacker dice, except for the airstrike, which is really more like a first strike. Here are the defender rules that you can see. They score a 6 and a 5. As mentioned, they have double fire, so the German attackers are going to receive 2 hits, and they're going to be applied to the weaker units, which in this case are the German infantry. And so we can see the German infantry reduced from level 4 values to now level 3 values to apply the 2 hits. And as you would expect, the final sequence in the battle is the attackers getting to roll, and the attackers have a lot more dice, so let's do it. And we get to roll 4 dice altogether, or 4 sets of dice, each one representing a German unit. I always like to start with the strongest German units first, which in this case are the armored units. They get double fire, and you can confirm those firepower values again by looking at the unit data table up here. There's information to look at their speeds depending on the season. We're in dry, so there's the speed stats, but you also get information on their firepower as well. And you can see that the armor, whether it's offense or defense, have double fire. You can see that for mech, single fire, double fire applies to offense and defense respectively. Finally, infantry will always have single fire. And there's a few others to talk about, but for this scenario, we're only going to have to worry about the main 3 that you see up there. So anyways, we can actually add up the German hits. We can see that the first 2 sets are going to be the Panzers, the German armor, so they have double fire. They score a hit on this 5 and a 6, while the infantry only score hits on 6s. So if you add it up all together, that's going to be 4 German hits, plus the German airstrike is a total of 5 German hits altogether. As I said before, the German defenders, or excuse me, the Soviet defenders have double defense. Because they have double defense, the attackers only score basically 5 out of 6 hits. And that last little bit gets to be rounded down, meaning that the Soviets get to stay alive for another round. So had the Germans scored only 1 more hit, they would have neutralized Rostov. Half hits simply do not apply to these types of battles. So anyways, Soviets receive some hits, and now we can move on to the other battles as well. So next up, we're going to do the battle river crossing here. Something to take note about river crossings is that in addition to the normal dice hits, there are the repulse hits. And we can check those values in another table. And by the way, this game has a lot of tables, if you can't tell, but that's the nature of wargaming. And frankly, I like data. And I'm sure if you're through watching this channel, you like a little bit of data as well. So that's not a problem for us. Here for the assault repulses, you can see that depending on the type of assault, there's actually different values for repulse. So on the upper end of dice, those values of 4, 5, and 6 are going to apply to actual combat hits. But on the lower end of those dice rolls, 1, 2s, or 3s, they're going to apply to repulses. They're not going to damage your units, but they're going to force your units back to their starting place. And all that movement, all the expenditure of command points was for nothing. So river assaults is going to be a repulse on a 1 or a 2. If it was a mud season, it would be 1, 2, or 3. Airstrikes is only 1 unless it's a fort. And then for sea invasions, the main factors are what unit is launching the attack, what unit type, and also who dominates the body of water. You know, friendly naval supremacy, naval parity, or enemy naval supremacy, all of that has to do with the naval side of the game, but it's important to mention it now as well. So anyways, let's see what the Soviets roll then to see if they can repulse the German attack. And let's see what they do. They end up scoring 5 or 6, which are really great combat dice, but our Soviet troops are not the best fighting troops. They can only score on single fire, so they score 1 hit and fail to achieve any repulse. And so that 1 hit will be applied to this German mech unit or armor unit that you see there. And then now the attackers get to roll, and when the Germans roll their dice, they get to roll 2 5s, again with the double fire of the armor, is 2 hits that apply to this Soviet unit. Now this Soviet unit is in open terrain. It doesn't have that double defense. It only has a single defense. And so this unit is rapidly eliminated by the German breakthrough. So the Germans have broken through the front, destroyed one Soviet army, and now the Soviets are going to have to do something about that. And so the Germans controlled the new hex, so that's good for the German attacker. First major successful battle, although the Battle of Rostov was pretty good as well, but they just failed to do that last little breakthrough. Next, we're going to do the Battle of Rostov E2, East 2, 2 hexes east of Rostov. We'll see what happens here. The defenders are a mech unit, so they get double fire, and then the defenders are, the attackers are infantry, 35th Corps. Let's see what the defenders do. They score a 2, 4, and a 5, meaning that the 2 does result in a repulse. They also scored a 5, and that hit would have applied to this, or does apply to this German unit. And I think in the sequence I actually forgot to mark the hit, so oopsies, but you get the point. The most important thing to note is that because of this 2, that German unit will be repulsed, and that's that. Finally, we have one last battle here, Battle of Kotelnikovo, and we're going to see what the defenders get to do. They get to roll 2 more dice as well. They score a 2, being a repulse, and that's it, no hits. And the repulse is going to apply to the weaker German unit, which in this case was that German infantry unit, while the German army unit gets to stay and now actually roll its dice to attack. And so finally we see the Soviets, the German Panzer Corps roll its dice to score a hit. They score a 6. They don't destroy the Soviet 16th Army, but they do score a hit against it, and it's reduced by 1. And so that pretty much sums up the entire German sequence. The way you end up finishing the turn is doing a supply phase. You would normally check the supply status of your enemy opposing units to see if you've encircled any, essentially. We haven't done any encirclements yet, so we don't have to worry about that. And then the final thing to do is to hide the defending units. So all the battles in which the German attackers failed to break through, the Soviets get to hide their units. And since they were the original defenders, they get to be the hidden units in those newly contested hexes. So now we have 3 contested hexes on the front, all of which are under Soviet control, as is shown by the fact that the Soviets are hiding their troops. Meanwhile, the German attackers are a little bit more vulnerable, and they're busy attacking enemy positions. But they're susceptible to enemy flanks, right? So that pretty much sums up the German sequence. Let's go ahead and move on to the Soviet side, or the Soviet phase of the turn, and now see how the Soviet player is going to respond in the sequence so that we may wrap up this turn and wrap up this video. And so last thing to do, of course, is to always hide that German HQ, deactivate it, reduce it by 1, and return it to its hidden status. And now we're going to switch to the Soviet side and see how the Soviet player responds. They're going to activate their Stavka HQ, and the Stavka HQ is a Supreme HQ, and these are different than the field HQs in that they have unlimited range, but they only have so many moves. For every command value, they have essentially 2 Supreme moves. So altogether, this Stavka can have 6 Supreme moves on this turn, and it's able to command 6 units, essentially, or a combination thereof. And so we're going to see that. The first move that the Soviets do is they're going to move a unit via rail from Tbilisi, and they're going to reinforce it to the front. And that's basically what happens here. This unit moves quite rapidly via rail all the way from Tbilisi, all the way around, passing all these little towns, passing Batumi, and making its way to another Soviet town called Armavir. And the idea here is that the Germans have achieved a breakthrough in the north, and so the Soviets are going to fall back to a new defensive line, essentially. And so this move can be done via rail because all this territory is under Soviet control. It's friendly control movements. We're not moving this unit into a battle hex. We're not moving this unit into a contested hex. All we're doing is moving it from one friendly zone to another, and this is where those rail moves are allowed. So rail moves are kind of like specialized You can think of them as strategic reinforcing moves. They're not really operationally combative moves. They're really more intended to move around reinforcements at a larger scale and at a faster rate than, say, have these units either march or move via road. So that's one strategic move. So that's 1 out of 6. So we have 5 more left. Here's another one. This Soviet Union decided to fall back from Rostov or near Rostov and actually fall back to a new sector called Maikop. And it's going to basically make up part of another Soviet defense. So now the Soviets have 3 units defending these sectors further south. They have a river to block them, which is going to be advantageous for them. And Maikop, of course, is an industrial sector, resource area, and it's going to provide production points to either side, whoever controls it. So it's important that either side try to take it, of course. And then what else? So that's already 2 out of 6. So that was a move. That could have that move was done via land, because you can see that the unit is not using the rail lines to move. It simply marched to the south. And so the third move we're going to have is the Soviets are going to move what was formerly a mech unit here in the Don. It's actually going to reinforce Kotelnikovo. It gets to remain hidden as well, as the hex is still Soviet controlled. So now the Soviets have 2 units protecting Kotelnikovo against the German attackers' 1 unit. So there's that. And then it looks like that was move number 3. Move number 4 looks like the Soviets are moving some other units, moving it out of the swamps to south of Stalingrad. So that's another interesting move. And then the final move that the Soviets do is that they're going to move a unit via rail and actually move it from Maikop. And I think they're going to try to get it near Stalingrad. And it basically moves all the way up north. And you can actually count all the steps that it moved, starting in Maikop. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to get to Astrakhan, and then 9, 10. And so typically a rail move is 10 hexes in length, but you can spend 2 rail moves to move a unit extra distance. And so they spent 2 supreme moves to move this unit a total of 11 hexes. So that goes to show that you can combine your supreme moves, at least for rail moves. I think, in fact, that only applies to rail moves. You can't like double the length, double march a unit necessarily via road or via foot. It only applies to rail moves. And that's probably the special ability of trains, that they can move and operate 24/7, 365. And they are really the fastest means of transportation to move large formations in this game, or in the war for that matter, in these historical times in which tanks were important, but so were trains and so were ships. So anyways, Soviets essentially spend 6 supreme moves altogether. They did 2 to move this 1 unit double via rail, and essentially a few other units were moved operationally, and I think 1 more was moved via rail all the way there. So you can see how the front has changed. The Soviets have basically abandoned this entire southern sector of the front. They've fallen back to a new defensive line while simultaneously fixing up their defensive lines south of Stalingrad. So interesting move by the Soviets, a smart play by the Soviets, I would say, in conserving their forces in reacting to the German situation. And so that pretty much sums up the Soviet turn. Since we're at the end of the second fortnight, we can actually move on to production. And I'm actually going to skip that, I think, for this video. But basically the production, you count your amount of production points, which in this case are shown over here in this table. And you can basically go ahead and calculate that. I think I'm going to save that for the next part of the video. And so stay tuned for that, and I will see you all as we transition into the next fortnight for the next round of combat.